At a lavish Thanksgiving dinner, my son-in-law's father grabbed my 10-year-old grandson by the collar and slammed him brutally into the oak-paneled wall. His wife simply took a sip of her expensive wine, smiled, and said, "Good, that boy needs to learn how to behave in this house." My blood ran completely cold. I did not scream. I did not throw a punch. I slowly stood up, straightened my cheap tie, pulled out my phone, and made one single phone call. I looked the man dead in the eye and said into the receiver, "Walk down grid 7, liquidate the Preston holdings now." They laughed, thinking I was just a senile old fool. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. If you are just starting to watch this story, now take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you is something I never imagined would happen in front of my own eyes. If you have ever had to stand up to toxic in-laws who thought they were untouchable, please hit the like button to bring a little sunshine to this grandfather's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next life stories, and tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me really happy to know which corner of the country is listening to me. The sound of my grandson hitting that wall was a sickening, hollow thud that instantly silenced the entire dining room. The clinking of crystal glasses and the soft hum of classical music playing in the background stopped dead. Lucas slid down the expensive wallpaper, landing on the floor in a terrified, crumpled heap. His small hands instinctively flew up to protect his head, a defensive posture that no 10-year-old boy should ever know how to make. He was trembling violently, his eyes wide with a pure, unadulterated fear that tore right through my soul. He had simply knocked over a glass of water onto a Persian rug. That was his supposed crime. I looked at Victor Preston, a prominent local real estate tycoon, standing over my grandson, with his chest puffed out, his face flushed with unreasonable rage. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, seemingly proud of his display of dominance over a child. Patricia Preston, his wife, sat perfectly still at the head of the table. She swirled the red wine in her glass, her face a mask of cold, calculated cruelty. She did not even flinch. She just smiled that icy, wicked smile and approved of the violence. My daughter Emily sat frozen in her chair across the table. Her face drained of all color, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to stay upright. I waited for her husband Derek to stand up. I waited for him to defend his stepson, to defend his wife, to be a man. Instead, Derek casually wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, looked at me and sighed an annoyed, heavy sigh. "Calm down, Richard," Derek said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Stop acting like an overprotective old fool. It was just a little push. The kid is too soft anyway. He needs discipline, and my father is just giving him a dose of reality. You need to sit back down and mind your own business." I did not sit down. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in a shouting match with a room full of arrogant cowards. I simply walked around the long dining table, my footsteps silent on the hardwood floor, and knelt beside Lucas. I gently placed my hand on his trembling shoulder, shielding his small body with my own. "Are you okay, buddy?" I whispered. He nodded slightly, too terrified to speak, tears streaming silently down his pale cheeks. I helped him to his feet, keeping my arm wrapped tightly around him. Derek scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Derek muttered. "You are ruining Thanksgiving over a spilled glass of water and a bruised ego. You are acting pathetic. Sit down and eat your turkey." As I stood there holding my grandson, holding the fragile, shaking weight of this little boy, my internal monologue shifted. For 30 years, I was a federal prosecutor. I spent 3 decades dismantling organized crime syndicates, hunting down corrupt politicians, and putting cartel bosses behind iron bars. I have sat across interrogation tables from some of the most dangerous, ruthless predators on the North American continent. I know what a monster looks like. I know how they breathe, how they speak, and how they think. And looking into Victor Preston's eyes, I did not see a successful businessman or a strict grandfather. I saw the dead, remorseless eyes of a true predator. I saw a man who fed on the weak, who used violence to maintain control, and who believed his wealth made him completely untouchable. My modest life in the suburbs, my cheap suits, my quiet demeanor as a retired insurance adjuster. It was all a carefully constructed cover. After a lifetime of making dangerous enemies, I chose to fade into the background. I chose to hide my $80 million net worth, my connections, and my power, so my family could live in peace. Emily never knew the full extent of my past. Derek certainly did not know. To the Preston family, I was just a pathetic, low-level pensioner who was lucky to be invited to their opulent estate. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a sheep surrounded by wolves. They had no idea they had just invited a lion into their den. I did not argue with Derek. Arguing with arrogant men is a waste of breath. I simply looked at Emily. Her eyes met mine, filled with a desperate, silent plea for help. "Grab your coat, Emily," I said, my voice dangerously calm, yet leaving absolutely no room for debate. "We are leaving right now." Emily stood up immediately, grabbing her purse with shaking hands. Derek slammed his fist on the table, making the silverware rattle. "You walk out that door, Emily, and do not bother coming back," he threatened, his voice booming through the large room. "You and your crazy father are overreacting." I ignored him completely. I guided Lucas toward the grand entryway, with Emily following closely behind us. We did not look back. We did not pause. We just walked out the heavy front doors and stepped into the crisp November air. The chill of the autumn night hit my face, but a different kind of cold was already spreading through my veins. A familiar, calculated coldness that I had not felt since my days in the courtroom. As we walked down the sprawling, illuminated driveway toward my old beat-up sedan, I could hear Derek and Victor laughing on the porch. Their cruel, mocking laughter echoed behind us in the dark. They thought they had won. They were dead wrong. The real war had only just begun tonight. I secured Lucas into his seatbelt and gently closed the rear passenger door. Emily climbed into the front, staring blankly ahead, her breathing shallow and uneven. I walked around to the driver's side and slid behind the steering wheel. I placed my hands firmly on the worn leather, feeling a steady rhythm return to my heavy heart. My phone buzzed in my pocket, illuminating the dark cabin with a harsh white light. I pulled it out and read a single text message from Tommy. It was very brief, but absolutely perfect. He said, "Grid 7 is completely locked down, and the financial panic is about to start. The Preston family assumed their stolen wealth shielded them from all consequences. They believed they could terrorize my grandson without ever facing a reckoning. By tomorrow morning, they would wake up penniless, exposed, and utterly destroyed." The drive back to my neighborhood was shrouded in a thick, suffocating silence. Rain began to fall, pattering against the windshield of my old sedan. I navigated the familiar, quiet streets of my modest suburban subdivision, pulling into the narrow driveway of the single-story house I had called home for the last 12 years. It was a simple place. A chipped wooden porch, overgrown azalea bushes, and peeling white paint. To my daughter, it was a humble refuge. To the Prestons, it was a joke. To me, it was the perfect camouflage. Emily sat frozen in the passenger seat, staring blankly at the wet pavement. I turned off the engine and looked at her. Her hands were clutching her purse so tightly, her knuckles were completely white. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling in the dark cabin. "You should not have done that. Derek is going to be absolutely furious when he figures out we actually left." I gently unbuckled my seatbelt. "He will have to get over it, Emily. No one treats my grandson that way." She shook her head, tears welling in her tired eyes. "You do not understand. Victor and Derek are just under a lot of pressure right now. They are so stressed about business. The real estate market is tough, and Victor has a lot on his plate. He did not mean to hurt Lucas. He just slipped and fell because the floor was completely slick from the water he spilled." I looked at my brilliant, beautiful daughter and felt a sharp ache in my chest. She was reciting a script, a carefully implanted lie designed to excuse the unforgivable. I did not argue with her ridiculous claim. I just opened the front door and ushered them inside out of the rain. Once inside, the warmth of the small living room offered a temporary illusion of safety. I led Lucas to the faded floral sofa and sat him down gently. He was still clutching his shoulder, his small chest heaving with silent, suppressed sobs. I went to the bathroom, grabbed the first aid kit, and brought a warm washcloth back to the living room. "Let me take a look at that shoulder, buddy," I said softly. He flinched when I reached out, a reaction that made my blood run cold all over again. I carefully rolled up the sleeve of his button-down shirt. The skin around his collarbone was red and rapidly swelling from where Victor had slammed him into the wall. But that was not what made my breath catch in my throat. Just below the fresh injury wrapped around his slender bicep was a cluster of older faded bruises. They were shaped perfectly, like a large adult hand, faint yellowish-green marks that told a horrific story of systematic abuse. I touched the edge of the old bruise. Lucas looked down at his feet, shame radiating from his small body. "Did you get this from playing soccer, Lucas?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady, hiding the absolute fury boiling inside me. He shook his head slowly. "No, Grandpa. I fell down the stairs last week." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. Another script. Another implanted lie. The Prestons were not just arrogant snobs who lost their temper. They were methodically terrorizing this boy and forcing him to hide it. My own flesh and blood was living in a nightmare, and they thought I was too blind, too old, and too foolish to see the signs. I wrapped a cold compress around his shoulder and pulled him into a tight embrace. "You are safe here, Lucas." I whispered into his hair. "I promise you no one is ever going to hurt you again." I made a cup of herbal tea for Emily, watched her take a mild sedative, and tucked them both into the spare bedroom. I waited by the door until their breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of exhausted sleep. Then I turned and walked quietly down the narrow hallway to the basement door. The wooden stairs creaked slightly as I descended into the darkness. I turned on a single dim overhead bulb. The basement looked like the dusty storage room of an ordinary retired insurance adjuster. Cardboard boxes filled with old tax returns, rusted garden tools, and a broken lawnmower. I walked past the clutter to a heavy metal workbench bolted to the concrete wall. I reached beneath the thick metal frame and pressed my thumb against a hidden biometric scanner. A soft click echoed in the damp air. A false panel behind the workbench slid open smoothly, revealing a heavy steel safe. I punched in a complex 16-digit code and swung the heavy door wide. Inside was a sleek military-grade encrypted laptop. I pulled it out, set it on the workbench, and powered it up. The screen glowed with a sequence of complex security protocols. I bypassed them effortlessly. My modest life upstairs was nothing more than a carefully crafted theater. When I retired from the Department of Justice, I did not just walk away with a pension. I took decades of financial intelligence, seized assets from dismantled criminal networks, and a deep understanding of global banking. I managed a shadow portfolio worth over $80 million, untraceable, secure, and entirely at my disposal. The Prestons thought my greatest asset was a dusty retirement account. They were spectacularly wrong. I opened a secure communication channel and linked directly to the financial dashboard Tommy had established for me. My screen illuminated with a cascade of scrolling data. The entire financial architecture of the Preston family empire was laid out before me in glowing red text. I leaned closer to the screen, watching the digital siege unfold in real time. Tommy had executed the order flawlessly. Grid 7 was an aggressive federal lockdown protocol. I watched as Victor Preston's primary corporate accounts flashed from active to frozen. Then the personal accounts followed. A notification popped up in the corner of my screen. It was a live feed of Derek's credit card activity. He was currently at an upscale bar near his estate, likely trying to drink away the frustration of the evening. I watched the transaction log update. An attempt to charge $400 for expensive whiskey. Status declined. A minute later, another card was swiped. Declined. Then a third, his prestigious black card. Declined. I sat alone in the quiet, damp basement, watching the little red errors multiply across the monitor. The panic had officially set in. Derek and Victor were suddenly trapped in a financial blackout, completely cut off from the wealth they used to intimidate the world. They thought they held all the power. They thought they could break my family and walk away laughing. I watched the screen with a cold, unrelenting focus. I was going to tear their fraudulent empire apart brick by brick, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. Every single dollar they had stolen, every asset they had accumulated to build their illusion of superiority was about to be burned to ashes. The hunt for absolute justice had finally begun. The pale morning sun had barely crested the horizon when the aggressive crunch of tires on my gravel driveway broke the suburban silence. I was already awake, sitting at my small kitchen table with a cup of black coffee waiting. When you spend 30 years predicting the movements of desperate criminals, you learn their rhythms perfectly. I knew they would come. The sudden, inexplicable freezing of their entire financial network would absolutely terrify them, but their boundless arrogance would blind them to the true cause. They would look for a technical glitch, an administrative mistake, a temporary inconvenience caused by incompetent bank employees. And they would ultimately come to me, the seemingly harmless old man, to maintain the fragile illusion of family harmony while they sorted out their disastrous mess. A heavy, rapid knock rattled the thin wood of my front door. I took one last slow sip of my bitter coffee, composed my features into a carefully crafted mask of weary, docile old age, and shuffled deliberately toward the entryway. I pulled open the door to greet my guests. Derek and Victor stood on my porch, surrounded by the crisp morning air. Victor looked uncharacteristically disheveled, the sharp edges of his usual polished confidence dulled by a long night of obvious panic. Derek held a crushed, cheap cardboard box of supermarket donuts in his trembling hands, a pathetic peace offering from men who valued absolutely nothing but cold, hard currency. "Good morning, Richard," Derek said. His voice was entirely devoid of the sneering superiority he had wielded the night before. Instead, he forced a tight, artificial smile that made my stomach turn completely inside out. "We wanted to come by early to check on Lucas and clear up that massive misunderstanding from dinner." "May we come in, Richard?" I stepped aside flawlessly, playing the part of the intimidated passive father-in-law. They walked into my modest living room, their expensive Italian leather shoes tracking damp earth onto my faded carpet. Victor immediately launched into his rehearsed performance. He placed a hand over his heart, perfectly simulating the posture of a deeply remorseful grandfather seeking forgiveness. "Richard first owe you and the boy a profound apology." Victor began, his voice dripping with practiced, sickening sincerity. "It was an absolute accident. When Lucas spilled that water, the rug became incredibly slick. I stepped forward to help him clean it up, my foot slipped, and I completely lost my balance. I tried to brace myself against the wall and accidentally pushed the boy in the process. It breaks my heart to think you believed I acted out of sudden anger." Derek quickly chimed in, nodding his head eagerly. "Exactly, Dad. It was just a chaotic, confusing moment. And my mother, well, you know her dark, unusual sense of humor. She was just making a terrible joke to break the tension, trying to lighten the difficult mood in the room. She feels absolutely horrible about how it sounded. It was all just a big, unfortunate misunderstanding between family members." I looked at the two men standing in my quiet living room, listening to the absolute garbage pouring endlessly from their lying mouths. They were lying straight to my face, entirely confident that my senile, uneducated mind would swallow their ridiculous fiction without a single probing question. I thought about the bruised hand-shaped welts on my young grandson's fragile arm, but I kept my breathing steady and my facial expression completely blank. "I understand," I said, making my voice sound appropriately weak, shaky, and relieved. "Thank you for taking the time to come here and explain it to me. It was a very stressful night for everyone involved. I am just so glad to hear it was only an accident." Derek visibly relaxed his tense shoulders, dropping significantly as he exhaled a heavy breath of relief. He set the cheap donuts on my old coffee table and rubbed the back of his neck seamlessly, transitioning to his real hidden agenda. "Well, I am glad we are past that," Derek said, pacing slightly across the floor. "Because honestly, we are dealing with a massive headache this morning. It seems our primary bank is experiencing some catastrophic nationwide system failure. Every single one of our business and personal accounts is temporarily locked. It is highly embarrassing, especially with the huge real estate closing we have officially scheduled for tomorrow afternoon." Derek stopped pacing and looked at me with a pathetic, calculating gleam in his desperate eyes. "You worked as an insurance adjuster for years, right? You used to process large claims with the local branch of First National. Do you still know anyone over there? Any old buddies who could look into a banking routing error for us? Just to push things through a little bit faster than normal." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his request was staggering. He was standing directly in the home of the man whose daughter he chronically abused, whose grandson his father brutally battered, actually asking for a personal favor. He genuinely believed that my entire professional network consisted of a few mid-level branch managers at a local credit union. He had absolutely no idea that the man standing quietly in front of him had the ultimate power to seize sovereign wealth funds across international borders with a single keystroke. I lowered my gaze, adopting the flawless persona of a helpful, eager-to-please old man. "I might know a guy in the fraud department," I mumbled, shuffling slowly toward the kitchen counter where my phone rested. "Let me see if I can get him on the line for you. It is pretty early in the day, but I will do my absolute best for you, Derek." "Thank you, Richard," Victor said, clapping me on the shoulder with a heavy, patronizing and condescending hand. "We really appreciate the help. We are just in a bit of a financial bind today." I picked up my phone, turned my back to them, and dialed a dummy number that automatically routed to Tommy's secure federal line in Washington. I held the phone to my ear, waiting for the fabricated ringing to stop. "Hey Jim, it is Rick Caldwell," I said aloud, faking a folksy tone. "Sorry to bother you so early, but my son-in-law is having a strange issue with his accounts. Looks like a widespread system lock. Can you check his profile and maybe clear a path for a minor operational account, just so they can buy breakfast today?" I paused briefly, pretending to listen to a technical explanation. "Yes, I understand completely. A security protocol glitch. If you could just release the secondary expense account, that would be truly wonderful." "Thanks, Jim." I hung up the phone and turned back to Derek and Victor, offering a modest smile. "Jim managed to manually unfreeze your secondary expense account," I explained quietly. "It should have exactly $15,000 in it. Just enough to get you both safely through the long weekend without any major problems." Derek exhaled sharply, a smug grin spreading across his face. He believed he had charmed his way out of a financial catastrophe, relying on the pity of an old man he secretly despised. "Thank you, Richard." Derek said, his tone shifting back to the patronizing drawl he reserved for service workers. "I knew your corporate connections would be good for something. 15,000 is tight, but we can make it work for the weekend. We will have the primary accounts sorted by Monday morning anyway. It is a minor inconvenience." Victor nodded, checking his gold watch, as if he had suddenly remembered pressing engagements. "Exactly," Victor chimed in, smoothing his expensive lapels. "We appreciate the assist. We will handle the banking errors from here. Come along, Derek, we have calls to make before the markets open." Derek turned toward the hallway where Emily had been quietly observing. She looked incredibly small, her posture rigid and tense. Derek took 2 strides toward her and draped his arm around her shoulders. It was meant to look affectionate, but I saw the visceral reaction it provoked. Emily flinched. It was an uncontrollable shrinking away from his touch, as if his hand was a burning iron. She froze entirely, her eyes dropping to the floor, her breathing instantly becoming fast. "I will swing back by tomorrow afternoon to pick you up," Derek told her, squeezing her shoulder a fraction too hard. "Take the day to rest. You both need to calm down before we go back to our normal routine. Do you understand me, Emily?" She nodded mechanically, her voice barely rising above a whisper. Yes, Derek. I understand. With a dismissive wave, Derek and Victor walked out the front door. I watched through the window as they sped down the street, completely oblivious to the federal snare tightening around their necks. The moment the sound of their engine faded, the suffocating tension in the living room lifted, replaced by a profound silence. I turned to look at my daughter. She was still staring at the closed door. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the coffee maker, the rhythmic sounds providing a grounding anchor. Emily, I said gently, are you sure that everything is okay at home? You do not have to protect them. You can tell me the truth. She walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table, wrapping her arms around her waist. She took a deep breath, and then she began to recite a script. It was a monologue I had heard variations of thousands of times during my career, delivered by terrified victims, desperately trying to convince themselves of a beautiful lie. Everything is perfectly fine, Dad, she said, her tone unnervingly bright and hollow. Derek is under a tremendous amount of pressure right now. Providing for our family at that level is demanding, and he carries so much responsibility. He gives us a beautiful home, he pays for Lucas to attend a prestigious private school, and he works hard to secure our future. Last night was a stressful anomaly. Victor is a passionate man, and sometimes his energy gets misinterpreted. I am just clumsy, and Lucas is going through a sensitive phase. We need to be supportive of Derek. I listened to her rehearsed defense, my heart breaking. She was defending her captor, protecting the very people who were systematically destroying her spirit. She had been conditioned to believe that their abuse was simply a byproduct of their success. I poured 2 cups of hot coffee, adding a splash of cream to hers. I set one down in front of her. Drink this, sweetheart, I murmured. You look freezing. She offered a weak, trembling smile and reached her right hand out to take the warm ceramic mug. As she extended her arm across the table, the loose sleeve of her oversized knitted sweater slid back toward her elbow. The morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen window illuminated her pale skin, and what I saw in that brief, fleeting moment made my entire world completely stop. There, wrapped around her delicate forearm, was a cluster of deep, fading bruises. They were the unmistakable, terrifying shapes of adult fingers pressed violently into her flesh. It was a grip mark. A brutal, forceful grip meant to restrain, control, and terrorize. The coloring of the bruises indicated they were at least a week old, transitioning from dark purple to a sickly, yellowish green. They perfectly mirrored the horrific hand-shaped welts I had seen on my young grandson's shoulder the night before. Emily noticed my gaze lock onto her arm. Panic flashed instantly in her wide eyes. She gasped softly and immediately yanked her arm back, frantically pulling the thick wool sleeve down to her wrist to cover the damning evidence. She looked away quickly, a deep flush spreading across her pale cheeks. I hit my arm on the heavy granite countertop a few days ago, she stuttered, her voice completely breathless, with pure and absolute panic. I was trying to reach a heavy serving platter from the top cabinet, and I just completely lost my footing. I am so incredibly clumsy lately, Dad. It is absolutely nothing, honestly. Please just do not worry about it. I did not say a single word. I just stood there looking down at my beautiful daughter, the child I had sworn to protect with my life, as she desperately tried to hide the physical evidence of her ongoing torture. I did not push her to confess. I did not confront her with the obvious, horrifying truth. Doing so would only push her further into her defensive shell. She was not ready to face the reality of her situation, but I no longer needed her confession to know exactly what had to be done. The rot inside the Preston family ran much deeper and was much more sinister than a simple instance of an arrogant grandfather losing his temper. Derek was not just a greedy, entitled finance executive laundering stolen funds. He was a violent, systematic abuser. He was physically assaulting my daughter, terrorizing my young grandson, and using his stolen wealth to construct an impenetrable fortress of silence around them. He was breaking them down, stripping away their dignity, their safety, and their autonomy piece by piece behind the closed doors of his luxurious, heavily gated mansion. A cold, terrifyingly calm rage settled over me, wrapping around my heart like a chain of solid steel. 30 years of prosecuting the absolute worst scum of humanity had taught me a fundamental truth about men like Derek and Victor Preston. Financial ruin would not be enough. Stripping away their wealth, freezing their bank accounts, and exposing their massive corporate fraud would cause them immense pain, but it would not neutralize the threat they posed to my family. I knew that cornered predators only become more violent, more desperate, and more dangerous. If I merely took their money, they would take their frustrations out on Emily and Lucas. They did not need to be taught a simple lesson in humility. They needed to be absolutely and irrevocably obliterated from the earth. I realized in that profound, silent moment in my kitchen that I could not just play the role of the vengeful father looking for a temporary victory. I had to become the executioner. I would dismantle their entire lives, sever every connection they had to the outside world, trap them in an airtight federal cage, and ensure they never saw the light of a free day ever again. I picked up my coffee and took a long, steady sip, the bitter liquid burning pleasantly against the back of my throat. My mind was already rapidly calculating the precise trajectory of the impending war. I waited until Emily was fully distracted in the living room sipping her coffee while staring out the front window at the rain. I told her I was going downstairs to check the circuit breaker, an excuse she accepted without a second thought. I descended into the basement, my footsteps heavy on the wooden stairs. The dim overhead bulb flickered as I approached my metal workbench. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The steel door of my safe clicked open, and I pulled out my encrypted laptop. I sat down on a wooden stool, the glow of the screen illuminating the corners of the room. Before Emily had married Derek, I knew I could never guarantee her safety from the variables of life. So I took precautionary measures. Using a network of offshore holding companies, I established an irrevocable trust fund in her name hidden from the public record and separate from my main portfolio. It was seeded with $5 million. I designed the parameters of this trust with meticulous care. It was an emergency lifeline, a financial parachute meant to catch her if she ever found herself in an inescapable situation. The rules were simple. The money could only be accessed with her physical signature, verified by a private banker I trusted with my life. She did not even know the full extent of the balance, only that if she ever needed an escape route, the resources were there waiting for her. I opened an encrypted portal that connected directly to the Swiss banking terminal hosting her trust. My fingers moved across the keyboard with precision. I bypassed the dual authentication protocols and watched the screen load the primary dashboard. The system verified my credentials and displayed the real-time account ledger. I stared at the numbers glowing on the display, paralyzed. A knot formed in the pit of my stomach, pulling the breath right out of my lungs. The account balance, the emergency fund I had built to protect my only daughter, was drained. The $5 million was gone. The available balance was listed as an empty zero. My mind raced. How was this possible? I immediately pulled up the transaction history, my eyes scanning the long, dense rows of data. The money had not vanished in a transfer. It had been systematically bled dry over the course of the last 2 years. I looked closely at the outgoing wire logs. Every single withdrawal was for the same amount. $9,900. I sat back on the wooden stool, running a hand over my tired face. I knew exactly what that number meant. During my 30 years as a federal prosecutor, I had indicted hundreds of money launderers and financial criminals who used this tactic. In the United States banking system, any cash transaction or wire transfer of $10,000 or more automatically triggers a currency transaction report, which alerts the Internal Revenue Service and federal financial regulators. To avoid this scrutiny, criminals break down massive sums into smaller transactions just beneath the reporting threshold. It is an illegal process known as smurfing or structuring. Derek and Victor Preston were not dipping into my daughter's emergency fund to cover corporate expenses. They were structuring fraudulent withdrawals to evade federal detection. They were moving her money through a labyrinth of shell accounts to hide their theft. I clicked on the archive tab demanding the system retrieve the physical withdrawal slips associated with the transactions. The bank required Emily's signature on the authorization forms to release the funds. If the signature was a forgery, my trusted banker would have flagged it immediately and halted the transfers. The scans populated on my screen one by one. I opened the recent withdrawal authorization dated just 3 days ago. I zoomed in on the signature line at the bottom of the page. It was Emily's signature. The loops and the structure of the letters matched her handwriting perfectly. But as I examined the image closely, the horrifying reality of what had happened became clear. I opened a handwriting analysis software program on my laptop, a tool I had retained from my days building federal cases. I ran the scanned signature through the system, comparing it to a sample of Emily's writing from a few years prior. The software processed the images, highlighting discrepancies in red. The results confirmed my worst fear. The signature on the withdrawal slip was jagged. The analysis revealed severe stress tremors running through every stroke of the pen. The pressure applied to the paper was uneven, indicating that the person holding the pen was shaking violently. The sharp stops and starts in the ink flow painted a terrifying picture. Emily had not signed these documents willingly. She had been forced. I pictured Derek standing over her, gripping her bruised forearm, shouting demands, while Victor blocked the door of his home office. I imagined my beautiful daughter, terrified and broken, signing her own emergency parachute away just to stop the yelling, just to avoid another assault. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. They had not just stolen her money. They had weaponized her fear to drain her resources, ensuring she had absolutely nowhere to run. But a glaring question remained echoing loudly in the basement. Why? Why would the Preston family, an elite dynasty commanding a multi-million-dollar local real estate empire, need to steal $5 million in increments? Why would men who flaunted luxury cars, country club memberships, and estates stoop to desperate financial structuring? Wealthy men do not drain trust funds using illegal evasion tactics unless they are trying to hide something larger. They do not risk federal prison for a few $1,000,000 unless their entire fortune is a total fabrication. The Prestons were not wealthy real estate tycoons. They were desperate predators bleeding my daughter dry to fund a lavish illusion. The grand mansion, the tailored suits, the arrogant smirks, it was all a facade constructed over a massive financial void. They had targeted Emily specifically because they knew she had access to untraceable capital, and they had married her solely to secure a fresh host to feed upon. I closed the trust fund portal and wiped the digital footprint from my hard drive. I carefully closed the steel door of the hidden safe, listening to the click of the lock engaging. I walked back up the wooden stairs, my mind detached from the quiet reality of my suburban home. The rules of engagement had just changed entirely. I was no longer dealing with an abusive husband and an arrogant father. I was hunting a pair of desperate financial criminals who had built their lives on a fragile house of cards. I knew exactly where to strike next to make their entire fraudulent empire come crashing down. I reached for my burner phone and opened a highly encrypted messaging application. I quickly typed a short direct message to my federal contact in Washington. The trap was finally being set, and the complete destruction of the Preston family was guaranteed. The pale afternoon sun struggled to pierce through the heavy layer of gray clouds hanging over the city. I parked my old, unremarkable sedan across the street from the prestigious private academy Lucas attended. The school was an imposing brick structure surrounded by towering wrought iron gates and meticulously manicured lawns. It was a glaring symbol of the wealth and status the Preston family loved to flaunt. I sat quietly in the driver's seat, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching the heavy oak double doors of the main entrance swing open as the final bell echoed across the courtyard. Children flooded out onto the concrete steps, their faces bright and animated with the simple, unburdened joy of youth. They laughed loudly, traded stories about their day, and ran carelessly toward the long line of luxury vehicles waiting at the curb. Then I finally saw Lucas. He emerged from the building, slowly lingering anxiously near the stone archway. Unlike the other children around him, he was not smiling. His small shoulders were hunched defensively, and his eyes darted frantically toward the street. He was desperately scanning the line of cars looking for Derek's silver Mercedes. The sheer, overwhelming terror radiating from his tense posture was palpable even from my distant vantage point. He was physically and mentally bracing himself for a return to the nightmare of his daily life. I stepped out of my car and walked deliberately across the street, moving toward the iron gates. When Lucas finally spotted me approaching, the immediate profound physical relief that washed over his face nearly broke my heart in two. He practically ran down the concrete steps, dodging other oblivious students, until he reached my side. He grabbed my hand with a desperate, crushing grip. "Are you picking me up today, Grandpa?" he asked, his voice trembling with a fragile, desperate hope. I squeezed his hand back firmly, offering him a warm, reassuring smile. "Yes, buddy, I am taking you home with me today." We walked back to my car in absolute silence. Once he was safely buckled into the passenger seat, I noticed he kept looking nervously over his shoulder. He kept checking the side mirror, as if he expected Derek's vehicle to suddenly appear out of nowhere and drag him violently away. I started the engine and smoothly pulled away from the school, leaving the affluent, deceptive neighborhood far behind us. I did not drive toward his mother's house. Instead, I navigated the winding suburban roads toward a quiet, secluded park on the absolute outskirts of town. It was a peaceful place where I used to take Emily when she was a little girl, a safe sanctuary shielded by towering oak trees and a calm, winding creek. I parked the car near the water, put the transmission in park, and turned in my seat to look directly at my grandson. The ugly red bruise on his neck was mostly hidden by his uniform collar, but his deep emotional wounds were fully exposed. I reached out and gently placed my hand on his tense shoulder. "Lucas, you know that you can tell me absolutely anything, right?" I asked him in a soft, steady voice. "You know that no matter what happens, I will always protect you." The boy stared down at his lap, his small hands nervously twisting the dark fabric of his school trousers. His chest began to heave erratically, and a quiet, agonizing sob escaped his trembling lips. The massive dam holding back his immense fear finally broke. He cried with the raw, uncontrolled intensity of a child who had been forced to carry a terrifying burden entirely alone. I unbuckled my seatbelt, reached across the center console, and pulled him into a tight embrace. I held him securely as he wept bitterly onto my shoulder. I let him cry until the heavy, racking sobs gradually turned into exhausted, quiet hiccups. I gently rubbed his back, murmuring quiet words of absolute comfort and safety. When he finally pulled back from our embrace, he wiped his tear-stained face with the back of his uniform sleeve. "Grandpa, I have to tell you something really important," he whispered, his voice cracking with lingering fear. "But you have to promise you will not tell Derek or Victor what I say. They specifically told me they would hurt Mom really badly if I ever told anyone." The mere mention of my daughter being physically threatened ignited a furious, blinding fire deep in my chest, but I kept my facial expression perfectly calm and collected. "I promise you, Lucas. They are never going to hurt your mother, and they are never going to hurt you again. Tell me exactly what happened." Lucas took a deep, shaky breath, trying to gather his courage. "It was not about the water I accidentally spilled at the dinner table," he began, his eyes wide and haunted by the horrific memory. "Victor was already extremely angry with me before we even sat down to eat the meal. I was desperately looking for a charging cable for my tablet, and I went into his private home office to try and find one. I thought absolutely nobody was in there. But when I walked in, I tripped over the thick edge of the heavy Persian rug near his large wooden desk. When I reached out to try to catch my balance, I bumped hard into the tall wooden bookshelf pressed against the back wall. But it was not just a regular bookshelf. My internal investigative alarms immediately began to blare. The fragmented pieces of the puzzle were rapidly shifting into sharp, terrifying focus. "What happened when you bumped into it, Lucas?" I prompted him very gently. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the empty park. The bottom part of the dark wood suddenly popped open. It was a secret hidden door, concealed right behind the bottom shelf. I was just trying to push it closed quickly, but I saw exactly what was hidden inside the hollow space. There was a huge, black canvas duffel bag shoved into the dark compartment. The metal zipper was broken, and things were actively spilling out onto the dusty floor. There were thick, heavy stacks of cash, but it was not regular American money. It looked like foreign currency, maybe euros tightly wrapped in thick rubber bands. And there were at least a dozen different passports scattered everywhere across the floor. I also saw several small black cellular phones still wrapped in their clear plastic boxes. Lucas paused, taking another ragged breath. I did not mean to look, Grandpa. I was honestly just trying to shut the wooden panel and leave. But then Victor walked directly into the room. Lucas began to tremble violently again at the vivid memory of the confrontation. He grabbed my arm so hard, his small fingernails dug into my jacket. He grabbed my arm, dragged me violently out of the office, and told me if I ever breathed a single word about what I saw, he would send my mother away to a place where I could never see her again. That is the absolute, unvarnished truth. The boy's words hung in the quiet air of the isolated park, heavy and suffocating. That is the absolute, unvarnished truth. I looked into my grandson's terrified, pleading eyes and felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over my entire being. The puzzle pieces were no longer scattered. They were rapidly assembling into a horrifying, crystal-clear picture of pure evil. I pulled Lucas into one last reassuring embrace, promising him once again that he was entirely safe and that the monsters would never touch him again. We walked back to my car, and I drove him straight to my house. I got him settled in the spare bedroom with his mother, who was still resting deeply under the influence of the mild sedative. I closed their door quietly, making sure the heavy deadbolt was locked tight. I marched directly down to my basement, the wooden stairs groaning under my hurried footsteps. I bypassed the biometric lock on my hidden safe, pulled out my encrypted laptop, and sat heavily on the wooden stool. I picked up my secure, untraceable phone and dialed a dedicated line that bypassed all standard telecom networks. The line rang exactly twice before a familiar gruff voice answered on the other end. "Tommy," I said, my voice steady but layered with an unmistakable urgency. "I need you to run a deep, comprehensive federal diagnostic on the Preston family, Victor and Derek. I need you to tear into every single corporate shell, every offshore holding, and every real estate limited liability company tied to their names. I need it done quietly, and I need it done right now." "Rick," Tommy replied, the sound of a keyboard already clacking rapidly in the background. "You know I can do that, but what exactly are we looking for here? You had me freeze their accounts yesterday. What did they do to trigger a full federal sweep?" I took a slow, deep breath, the damp basement air filling my lungs. Lucas found a hidden compartment in Victor's private home office this afternoon. He saw a canvas duffel bag packed with multiple foreign passports, untraceable burner phones, and massive stacks of tightly bound European currency. The physical assault on my grandson was not a random burst of anger over a spilled glass of water. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to terrorize a 10-year-old child into absolute silence. "They are hiding something massive, Tommy. Something that requires cash reserves and immediate international mobility." The rapid typing on Tommy's end stopped for a fraction of a second, then resumed with an aggressive, frantic intensity. "Give me 5 minutes to cross-reference their corporate identification numbers through the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network," Tommy said, his tone shifting into the sharp professional register of the federal director. "I am pulling up their primary real estate holding company right now. Let us see what these arrogant bastards are actually hiding behind their gated walls." I waited in the dim light of my basement, watching the cursor blink rhythmically on my own encrypted monitor. The silence stretched out thick with anticipation. 5 minutes felt like an absolute eternity. Finally, Tommy let out a low, breathy whistle that chilled me to the bone. "Rick," Tommy murmured, his voice laced with genuine disbelief. "The entire Preston real estate empire is a complete mirage. It does not exist. What do you mean it does not exist? I demanded, leaning closer to the laptop screen. They own dozens of commercial properties across the city. I have seen the development portfolios. It is a facade. Tommy explained, the sound of his fingers flying across his keyboard, echoing through the speaker. They do not own a single piece of actual physical real estate outright. Every single building, every single development project is leveraged to the absolute maximum limit. They have been creating dozens of dummy corporations, taking out massive loans against properties they barely hold equity in, and using the new investor capital to pay off the older, aggressively maturing debts. A Ponzi scheme. I said the words tasting like ash in my mouth. A massive, localized Ponzi scheme. A $50 million Ponzi scheme to be exact, Tommy corrected grimly. And based on these internal liquidity reports I am hacking into right now, the entire fraudulent structure is on the absolute brink of total catastrophic collapse. They have entirely run out of new investors to swindle. The interest payments are compounding faster than they can steal. They are completely drowning in toxic debt. The revelation hit me with staggering force. The puzzle was finally complete. The desperate arrogance, the sudden financial panic, the need to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth. But one vital, terrifying question remained. Why did they need Emily? I asked aloud, my mind racing back to the drained trust fund. If they were dealing in tens of millions of fraudulent corporate dollars, why would they bother bleeding a $5 million trust fund dry in small structured increments? I heard Tommy sigh heavily, a sound of profound pity and regret. Because your daughter was their final desperate lifeline, Rick. When the new investor money dried up 2 years ago, the scheme started to fracture. Derek did not marry Emily because he loved her. He married her because he conducted a quiet background check and discovered the massive secret trust fund you established. They have been using her $5 million as a direct, untraceable injection of capital to keep the entire $50 million house of cards standing just a little bit longer. My vision blurred with a sudden, violent surge of pure hatred. Derek had targeted my beautiful, trusting daughter. He had courted her, manipulated her, and married her entirely as a calculated financial strategy. He had subjected her to years of psychological torment and physical abuse just to maintain control over her signature. He viewed my daughter as nothing more than a convenient, disposable bank account. And it gets infinitely worse, Rick, Tommy said, his voice dropping to a harsh, serious whisper. I just ran their names through the International Flight Registry database. Victor and Derek purchased 2 one-way first-class tickets to Geneva, Switzerland. The flight departs next Friday at midnight. The passports your grandson found are their exit strategy. They are planning to flee the country and vanish into a non-extradition territory before the federal banking regulators realize the $50 million is completely gone. What about Emily? I asked, though my gut already knew the dark, horrifying answer. Tommy hesitated, the silence stretching painfully. I am pulling up the corporate structuring documents for the dummy companies they used to funnel the stolen money. Rick, they forged her signature on the primary incorporation papers. They named Emily as the sole executive director of the shell companies holding the most toxic, fraudulent debt. When the house of cards finally falls, when the investors demand their $50 million and federal authorities come knocking with warrants, Victor and Derek will be safely hidden in Switzerland. They are setting your daughter up to take the fall for their crimes. I did not respond immediately. The phone trembled in my hand. War was finally here. War was finally here. I disconnected the secure line and placed the heavy encrypted phone down on the metal workbench. My pulse beat a slow and steady rhythm against my neck. I needed irrefutable proof. I needed audio and video evidence of their conspiracy to submit to the federal grand jury, ensuring that no expensive defense attorney could ever unravel the case. Financial records were powerful, but a recorded confession of their intent to frame my daughter would seal their fate forever. I knew exactly how to get it. Earlier that week, Emily had casually mentioned a persistent leak under the marble sink in the downstairs powder room of their estate. Derek, of course, had refused to call a plumber, claiming he did not want strangers wandering around the house. It was the perfect excuse. Tonight was the annual regional real estate charity gala, an event Victor and Derek considered absolutely mandatory for maintaining their wealthy facade. They were scheduled to be out of the house until at least midnight. Patricia was joining them, eager to parade her expensive jewelry in front of the local elite. Emily and Lucas were safely tucked away in my guest room, fast asleep. I had a clear, unobstructed window to infiltrate the den. I opened the bottom drawer of my safe and extracted a small black canvas tool bag. Inside was not just a wrench and some pipe tape. Hidden beneath the false bottom lay 6 state-of-the-art military-grade micro cameras, each no larger than a button. Alongside them rested a specialized data cloning module capable of intercepting and mirroring a local wireless network. I swapped my cardigan for a dark, unremarkable utility jacket and grabbed a standard toolbox to complete the clever disguise. I drove my old sedan through the dark, quiet streets, arriving at the massive iron gates of the Preston estate shortly after 9 in the evening. I used the temporary access code Emily had given me months ago for emergencies. The heavy gates swung open smoothly. The sprawling mansion was entirely dark, save for a few automated landscape lights casting long, eerie shadows across the manicured lawn. I parked near the side entrance, grabbed my toolbox, and unlocked the wooden door. The interior of the house felt incredibly cold and hollow. It was a monument to their unchecked greed, filled with priceless art and imported furniture, yet utterly devoid of any real warmth or love. I walked straight to the downstairs powder room, dropped the toolbox loudly on the tile floor, and turned on the faucet. I unscrewed the pipes beneath the sink, letting the water drain slowly into a bucket. If anyone walked in, I was just a helpful father fixing a simple plumbing issue. But my real work was upstairs. I slipped on a pair of thin latex gloves and moved silently up the grand, sweeping wooden staircase. I headed straight for Victor's private home office, the nerve center of their fraudulent operation. The heavy mahogany door was locked, but a standard tumbler lock was no match for a man who used to seize cartel safe houses. I bypassed the mechanism in under 10 seconds and slipped inside. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and expensive leather. I worked with the practiced, ruthless precision of a seasoned operative. I planted the first micro camera inside the grill of the air purifier, humming softly in the corner of the room. It provided a perfect, unobstructed view of Victor's massive desk and the hidden compartment Lucas had discovered. The second camera went into the casing of a smoke detector positioned directly above the leather seating area. The third was wedged seamlessly into the spine of a thick, decorative encyclopedia on the highest shelf. Moving swiftly, I left the office and navigated down the hall to the primary living room. This was where Derek and Victor frequently drank whiskey and discussed their business strategies late into the night. I secured the fourth and fifth cameras within the intricate molding of the stone fireplace, ensuring the audio receivers were positioned to capture even the quietest whispers. The final camera was mounted high in the grand entryway, providing a clear visual of absolutely anyone entering or exiting the mansion. With the visual surveillance established, I needed to secure the digital perimeter. I located their primary wireless router hidden inside a custom media cabinet in the living room. I pulled the data cloning module from my pocket and connected the primary bypass cable directly to the main line. My small device immediately began to flash a rapid series of green lights as it effortlessly broke through their superficial network encryption. Within 90 seconds, the module had successfully cloned the master router. Every single email, text message, bank transfer, and web search executed on their network would now be silently mirrored and routed directly to my secure laptop in my basement. I detached the cloning device, concealed it back inside my pocket, and carefully closed the wooden media cabinet. I checked my watch. It was only 10:15. I had plenty of time to finish the fabricated plumbing repair and leave the premises completely undetected. I walked back down the hallway toward the powder room, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. The trap was perfectly set. But just as I reached the tiled threshold of the bathroom, the harsh, unmistakable glare of halogen headlights swept across the frosted glass of the front door. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. A heavy car engine rumbled aggressively in the driveway, followed immediately by the loud, angry squeal of tires skidding on the pavement. I heard a car door slam shut with explosive force. It was Derek. He was home almost 2 hours early and he sounded incredibly agitated. I moved with blinding speed. I dove into the powder room, grabbed my heavy wrench, and threw myself onto the floor, beneath the marble sink. I violently twisted the pipe fittings, ensuring water splashed across the tiles to make my cover story look entirely authentic. The heavy front door crashed open, slamming viciously against the interior wall. Derek stormed into the grand entryway, muttering a string of furious, venomous curses. I could hear his heavy footsteps pounding against the hardwood floors. He was pacing erratically, like a cornered animal. "I need more time," Derek yelled, likely screaming into his cellular phone. "I told you, Victor, we are completely blocked out of the secondary accounts. The bank manager is not returning my calls. We have to accelerate the entire timeline before the regulators start asking questions." I lay perfectly still on the cold tile floor, my breathing shallow and tightly controlled. He was entirely consumed by his own financial panic. He marched past the hallway leading to the powder room and headed straight for the kitchen, yanking open the refrigerator door with a violent crash. Glass bottles rattled and smashed together. This was my only window. I shoved my tools into the bag and zipped it. I grabbed the bucket, stood, and moved silently toward the back door. I slipped outside into the cool night air, pulled the door shut behind me, and vanished. I slipped outside into the cool night air, pulled the door shut behind me, and vanished. The heavy shadows of the manicured hedges provided perfect cover as I quickly navigated the perimeter of the estate. I reached my unmarked sedan, tossed the heavy canvas tool bag into the trunk, and slid behind the steering wheel. My heart was still hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my mind was completely locked onto the objective. I put the car in drive and sped away from the affluent neighborhood, the neon glow of the streetlights reflecting off my windshield. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, the adrenaline had settled into a cold, calculating focus. I walked through the front door and locked the deadbolt. The house was completely silent. Emily and Lucas were still sleeping soundly in the secure guest room upstairs, entirely unaware of the massive federal dragnet I was currently constructing around their abusers. I bypassed the kitchen and headed straight down the wooden stairs into the basement. Tommy was already there. He had let himself in through the side entrance using the key I kept hidden for emergencies. My dusty metal workbench had been completely transformed into a highly sophisticated federal war room. 3 large, high-definition monitors were glowing brightly in the dim basement, connected to a sprawling array of decryption servers and encrypted communication arrays. Tommy was sitting on my wooden stool, typing furiously on his mechanical keyboard. "You cut that entirely too close, Rick," Tommy murmured without taking his eyes off the center screen. "The data clone module you planted on their router just initiated a massive handshake protocol with my servers. We have a direct, unhindered pipeline into their entire digital ecosystem. Every keystroke, every voice call, and every single megabyte of financial data flowing through that mansion is currently routing straight into this basement." I pulled up a metal folding chair and sat beside him. I watched as the left monitor flickered to life. The screen split into a grid of 6 high-resolution video feeds. My micro cameras were functioning perfectly. The camera hidden inside the smoke detector provided a sweeping overhead view of the primary living room. The visual from the air purifier in Victor's office showed the heavy mahogany desk and the secret compartment Lucas had stumbled upon. Right on cue, Derek stormed into the living room feed. He was pacing furiously back and forth across the expensive Persian rug. He held a crystal glass of amber whiskey in his trembling hand. A moment later, Victor entered the frame. The older man looked physically exhausted, his usual arrogant posture replaced by a heavy, defeated slump. "Turn up the audio receiver on feed 4, I instructed Tommy. My eyes locked on the 2 desperate men. Tommy adjusted a slider on his mixing board. The sound of clinking ice and heavy, anxious breathing filled my quiet basement. "We are completely out of time, Victor." Derek shouted, his voice cracking with pure panic. "The secondary shell accounts are entirely frozen. The offshore holding managers are refusing to answer my calls. The local regulators have flagged the main real estate ledger for a secondary compliance audit. They are going to demand physical proof of the liquidity we do not have. Victor collapsed heavily onto the leather sofa. We have the exit strategy, Derek. Do not lose your nerve now. The flight is booked. We have the secondary passports and the offshore accounts in Geneva are primed to receive the final transfer. We just need to hold the illusion together for 4 more days. Tommy shifted his attention to the right monitor, pulling up a deeply encrypted email server. He rapidly decoded the intercepted data packets flowing from the Preston network. Look at this, Rick Tommy said, his finger pointing at a newly decrypted flight itinerary. I intercepted the confirmation emails they tried to scrub from their sent folders. They have confirmed 2 first-class tickets departing from the international airport this coming Friday. The flight leaves exactly at midnight. The routing sends them through a private layover in the Caribbean before touching down in Geneva. They are planning to vanish like ghosts. My jaw tightened as I read the flight details glowing on the monitor. They were leaving on Friday. It gave us less than 96 hours to dismantle a $50 million criminal enterprise, secure physical evidence, and coordinate a massive federal arrest without tipping them off. But the situation was about to become infinitely more volatile. I watched the center monitor as Derek walked into Victor's home office. The camera hidden in the encyclopedia captured his every movement. Derek sat down heavily at the mahogany desk and flipped open his personal laptop. He typed rapidly, his face illuminated by the bright glow of the screen. Tommy. What is he doing right now? I asked, leaning closer to the monitors. Track his keystrokes. Tommy's fingers flew across his keyboard, intercepting the real-time data feed from Derek's computer. The center monitor flashed, mirroring Derek's exact screen. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Derek was not logging into a standard banking portal. He was accessing a heavily encrypted, decentralized cryptocurrency exchange. Rick, this is a massive problem, Tommy whispered, his voice laced with genuine alarm. He is consolidating the remaining liquid capital from their fraudulent shell companies. He is pooling the stolen funds, including the $5 million he drained from your daughter's emergency trust. He is preparing to convert the entire stolen fortune into an untraceable, anonymous digital crypto wallet. I stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. The consolidated balance was staggering. Nearly $12 million in stolen cash was sitting in a temporary holding account, waiting to be permanently vanished into the digital ether. If that money entered the blockchain, it would bounce through a series of anonymous digital tumblers. It would become completely untraceable in a matter of seconds. We would never recover my daughter's trust fund, and the primary financial evidence required to guarantee a federal conviction would disappear forever. How much time do we have before he initiates the transfer? I demanded, my eyes fixed on the digital progress bar slowly loading on Derek's screen. He is running a complex security protocol to mask the origin of the funds before he hits send. Tommy explained, frantically typing commands to monitor the transaction protocol. The network handshake is buffering. The encryption keys need to align on both ends before the blockchain accepts the massive deposit. If he completes this verification process and clicks that final execution button, the money is gone. We will lose the physical trail. We will lose the hard evidence. We will have absolutely nothing to present to the grand jury. Can you freeze the digital wallet from here? I asked, my voice rising with urgency. Can you hack the exchange and block the outgoing transmission protocol? No. Tommy replied, his tone grim and resolute. It is a decentralized server. If I attempt to remotely hack the firewall, the system will instantly detect the intrusion and alert Derek. He will immediately know federal agents are actively watching him. I watched in agonizing silence as Derek completed the final encryption handshake on his laptop. He closed the lid with a heavy sigh, leaving the $12 million sitting in the decentralized holding wallet. Tommy explained that the funds were now locked in a digital escrow, pending a final authorization key that Derek would undoubtedly execute right before they boarded their flight to Geneva. We had to let the money sit. If we moved too soon, the roaches would scatter. We spent the next 3 days building an airtight federal indictment, compiling the intercepted wire transfers and fraudulent ledgers. By Tuesday evening, the tension inside my basement war room had reached a suffocating peak. Tommy had returned to Washington to brief the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, leaving me alone to monitor the live surveillance feeds. Emily and Lucas were still staying at my house, slowly beginning to heal from the trauma, though Emily remained deeply fragile and withdrawn. She thought Derek was simply giving her space to cool down. She had absolutely no idea about the monstrous reality unfolding across town. I sat on my wooden stool, sipping black coffee from a thick ceramic mug, staring at the grid of monitors. At exactly 9 o'clock, the motion sensor on camera 4 triggered a silent alert. The living room feed flickered as Victor and Derek strode into the frame. They looked significantly worse than they had over the weekend. Victor poured himself a massive glass of scotch, bypassing the ice entirely. He swallowed half the amber liquid in a single desperate gulp before turning to his son. "The old man is getting highly suspicious," Victor growled, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, captured perfectly by the microphone hidden in the fireplace molding. "Rick is a retired federal prosecutor, Derek. He is not some clueless suburban grandfather. He kept Emily and the boy at his house all weekend, and he has been asking our corporate receptionists highly specific questions about our recent property acquisitions. We cannot maintain this illusion for another 3 days. We have to accelerate the timeline." Derek paced the length of the room, running a frantic hand through his hair. "I agree," Derek said, his voice laced with venomous panic. "The local real estate board is already breathing down our necks for the quarterly liquidity statements. If Rick starts digging into the shell companies, the entire structure collapses before we even reach the airport." "So what is the accelerated play?" Victor set his empty glass on the marble coffee table with a sharp crack. "We neutralize the primary liability," Victor stated coldly. "We bring Emily back to the estate tomorrow morning. You will tell her you want to reconcile. You will play the apologetic, desperate husband. Once she is inside the house, we heavily medicate her. We use the prescription sedatives you acquired last month. We dose her food, her water, whatever it takes to render her completely docile and incoherent." Derek nodded slowly, a sick, calculating grin spreading across his face. "And then we drag her to Dr. Aris," Derek added. Victor affirmed the plan. "Yes. Aris is on our payroll. He has been covering our tracks for years. He will officially diagnose her as experiencing a severe aggressive psychotic break. He will sign the medical affidavit declaring her completely mentally incompetent. With that medical certification, you can invoke the emergency spousal provisions. You will force her to sign the irrevocable power of attorney." Derek laughed, a hollow, terrifying sound that echoed through the hidden microphone. "With the power of attorney, I have total, unhindered legal control over her remaining assets," Derek said, outlining the final stages of their brutal conspiracy. "I will authorize the final crypto transfer. Then we dump her in a state psychiatric ward on a mandatory 72-hour involuntary medical hold. She will be locked in a padded room screaming about stolen millions, and absolutely nobody will believe a word she says because she will be medically certified as insane." Victor nodded approvingly. "And the boy?" Victor asked. "Lucas is a massive liability. He saw the duffel bag in my office. He knows too much." Derek waved his hand dismissively. "I already contacted that disciplinary boarding school in upstate New York. It is basically a juvenile detention center for rich kids. I will sign the parental custody transfer tomorrow afternoon. We put him on a bus heading north. We dump Emily in the psych ward. We execute the final digital transfer, and we board the private charter flight to Geneva by Thursday night. They will both be completely locked away, and we will be untouchable." I sat quietly in the dark basement, the glowing light of the monitors reflecting off my face. The sheer, unadulterated evil of their plan defied all human comprehension. They were not just going to steal my daughter's money and flee. They were going to chemically lobotomize her, strip away her basic human rights, lock her in a mental asylum, and throw my young grandson into an abusive institutional prison just to cover their tracks. They viewed destroying my family as a simple, necessary administrative step in their grand financial exit strategy. A sudden violent pressure built up inside my chest, radiating down my arm and into my hand. I did not even realize how hard I was gripping the heavy ceramic coffee mug until the immense pressure caused it to violently shatter. The thick ceramic exploded into a dozen jagged shards, sending scalding hot black coffee and sharp fragments of pottery flying across my metal workbench. The hot liquid burned my skin, and a deep gash opened across my palm. Blood dripped onto the concrete floor, but I did not feel the pain. I did not feel anything except a cold, absolute, and terrifying rage. I grabbed a dark towel from the shelf and wrapped it tightly around my bleeding hand, my eyes never leaving the monitor. Derek and Victor continued to finalize the logistics of their escape, entirely unaware that the executioner was already standing at their gates. They believed they had outsmarted the system. They believed their wealth and arrogance made them invincible. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They had targeted the family of a man who knew exactly how to dismantle a criminal enterprise from the inside out. I reached for my secure phone and dialed Tommy's direct operational line. He answered immediately, the background noise of the federal headquarters humming through the speaker. "Tommy," I said, my voice eerily calm despite the violent storm raging inside me. "They are accelerating the timeline. They are planning to heavily medicate Emily tomorrow morning, force a medical declaration of insanity using a corrupt doctor, and dump her in a psychiatric ward to finalize the digital transfer. They are sending Lucas to a disciplinary camp and flying out by Thursday night." There was a long, heavy silence on the line. "What is our play?" Tommy asked, his tone shifting into absolute federal authority. "We do not wait for the warrant," I replied, watching the blood soak through the dark towel. "We strike tomorrow morning. We burn their entire empire to the ground. We strike, but we do it with absolute precision." I disconnected the secure line with Tommy and leaned back in the deep shadows of my basement. A standard police intervention was completely out of the question. During my preliminary investigation into the Preston family, I had uncovered a highly disturbing connection. Victor Preston practically owned the local police chief. The corrupt chief had been quietly receiving massive campaign contributions and illicit real estate perks for over a decade. He was essentially a compensated employee on the Preston payroll. If I dialed the local authorities, the dispatcher would immediately route the call, the chief would be notified, and Victor would receive a warning phone call before a single patrol car left the precinct. They would have exactly enough time to scrub their hard drives, initiate the cryptocurrency transfer, and drag my drugged daughter out the back door. I could not rely on the local justice system. I needed a specialized force. I picked up my secure satellite phone and dialed a heavily encrypted sequence of numbers. The call was routed directly to a private military contractor based in Washington. This was a highly classified unit comprised of former federal tactical operators and elite intelligence personnel. I had worked with them extensively during my time at the Department of Justice, utilizing their specialized extraction skills when official federal channels were tangled in red tape. The line clicked, and a calm voice answered the call. I identified myself using my old operational call sign. I told the director of operations that I required an immediate tactical extraction team deployed to my precise location. He informed me that mobilizing a Tier 1 strike force on such short notice would require a massive financial commitment. I did not hesitate for a single second. I opened a separate encrypted terminal on my laptop and accessed my primary offshore security accounts. I authorized the immediate release of my entire $80 million war chest. I transferred a staggering operational retainer directly into their untraceable corporate holding accounts. The money was absolutely meaningless to me now, except as a raw weapon to obliterate the men who had tortured my family. The funds would buy ghost flights, heavily armored black utility vehicles, and the absolute discretion of the finest operatives on the planet. The director confirmed the wire transfer and promised that 2 heavily armed tactical helicopters would be touching down at a secure airstrip on the edge of town by tomorrow afternoon. With the private extraction team fully mobilized, I reconnected the secure line to Tommy. The federal side of the operation had to dovetail perfectly with my private tactical strike. Tommy had been working relentlessly through the night, securing sealed arrest warrants from a trusted federal judge who had no ties to Victor Preston or the corrupt local political machine. We carefully mapped out the operational timeline. The trap was officially set for Thursday at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That was the moment Derek had scheduled to forcibly drag Emily into the office of his corrupt psychiatrist. The plan was simple, requiring flawless execution. My private tactical team would intercept Derek and his hired medical professional at the clinic, securing Emily before she could be drugged or forced to sign any legal documents, declaring her mentally incompetent. Simultaneously, Tommy would lead a massive, heavily armed federal strike team directly through the iron gates of the Preston estate. They would raid the mansion, seize the hardware before the final crypto transfer could be executed, and apprehend Victor Preston right in the middle of his luxurious, fraudulent fortress. We reviewed the tactical blueprints of the medical clinic and the sprawling estate, memorizing the designated entry points, the security blind spots, and the primary escape routes. There could be no margin for error. If Derek managed to execute that transfer, or if Victor managed to board that private jet to Switzerland, the entire operation would be a failure. Every moving part had to snap into place at 3 o'clock. I spent the remainder of the long, dark night meticulously preparing for the impending violence. The soft, comforting persona I had carefully maintained for the past decade was no longer necessary. I walked upstairs to my master bedroom, leaving the quiet hum of the basement war room behind. I opened my mahogany closet and reached past the casual, comfortable clothes I had worn since my retirement. I pulled off the thick, knitted cardigan that had defined my recent life as a quiet, unassuming suburban grandfather. It fell heavily to the hardwood floor, a discarded relic of a man who no longer existed. I reached into the very back of the closet and pulled out a tailored, charcoal black suit. I put on a crisp white shirt, fastened the dark buttons, and slipped the heavy, perfectly fitted jacket over my shoulders. The premium fabric felt exactly like armor. I walked over to the heavy iron gun safe bolted securely into the corner of my bedroom. I spun the mechanical dial, the heavy metallic clicks echoing sharply in the absolute silence of the house. I opened the heavy steel door and reached inside the dark compartment. I retrieved my standard-issue federal sidearm, a customized high-capacity pistol that had saved my life on more than one occasion during my highly dangerous career. I expertly checked the action, feeling the smooth, cold steel slide back and forth with flawless, oiled precision. I loaded a full magazine, the heavy brass cartridges sliding perfectly into place. I slapped the magazine firmly into the grip, racked the slide to chamber a live round, and secured the weapon safely in a thick leather shoulder holster, concealed beneath my dark jacket. I stood in front of the tall mirror, staring at the cold, ruthless reflection staring back at me. The gentle, forgiving grandfather who baked cookies and tended to a quiet garden was completely dead, systematically murdered by the extreme arrogance and brutal cruelty of Derek and Victor Preston. In his place stood a hardened, highly trained federal executioner, a man who possessed the financial resources of a small nation and the tactical fury of a highly trained predator. I adjusted the lapels of my dark suit, feeling the comforting, familiar weight of the loaded weapon pressing tightly against my ribs. I walked slowly down the hallway and quietly pushed open the door to the guest bedroom. Emily and Lucas were sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the massive storm that was about to break over the city. I looked at the dark bruises fading on my daughter's delicate arm, and I looked at the terrifying red welts still marking my young grandson's neck. A profound, icy calm washed over my entire soul. The Prestons had believed they were completely untouchable. They believed they could break my family, steal our financial future, and simply fly away to a life of luxurious, sunny impunity. Tomorrow afternoon, at exactly 3 o'clock, they were going to learn a devastating, fatal lesson about the absolute consequences of their unchecked greed. I quietly closed the bedroom door, walked back downstairs, and waited in the darkness for the morning sun to finally rise. The morning sun finally crested over the horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the frost-covered lawn. I sat motionless in the dim light of my living room, the heavy, comforting weight of the federal sidearm resting silently against my ribs. I did not sleep a single second. My mind was entirely locked into the tactical execution of the impending strike. I had spent the early hours coordinating the final logistical details with Tommy over the encrypted satellite line. The two separate strike teams were fully briefed, heavily armed, and completely synchronized. The federal raid on the Preston estate was scheduled to launch precisely when I breached the medical clinic. Every single variable had been calculated. There was absolutely no room for failure. Thursday afternoon arrived with a suffocating, heavy tension that seemed to entirely consume the crisp autumn air. At exactly 2 o'clock, the intercepted GPS tracker embedded in Derek's cellular phone began to move away from the sprawling Preston estate. They were adhering perfectly to the horrific schedule we had recorded on the hidden microphones. They were transporting my daughter. I sat in the back of an armored black utility vehicle flanked by 6 massive, highly trained private tactical operators. They were dressed in full tactical gear, wearing unmarked Kevlar vests, dark ballistic helmets, and carrying suppressed automatic rifles. We tracked Derek's silver Mercedes as it navigated through the affluent suburban streets, heading directly toward the upscale private psychiatric clinic owned by the corrupt doctor on their payroll. The clinic was situated in a sleek modern glass building, completely surrounded by tall, manicured hedges, designed to offer absolute discretion for its wealthy, secretive clientele. We pulled into the secluded rear parking lot at exactly 2:50. The tactical team leader, a towering man with cold, calculating eyes, looked at me and gave a sharp, silent nod. We moved out of the vehicle with absolute precision, forming a tight, deadly wedge as we approached the heavy glass doors of the private rear entrance. Inside the luxurious, soundproofed walls of the clinic, the scene unfolding in the primary waiting room was a picture of pure, unadulterated evil. It was exactly 2:55 in the afternoon. Through the tinted glass wall of the interior office, I could see them. Emily was slumped deeply into a plush leather chair, her head lolling dangerously to the side. She was heavily, aggressively drugged. Her beautiful eyes were half open, glazed over, and completely vacant, staring blindly at the polished hardwood floor. She looked incredibly frail, a fragile ghost of the vibrant woman I had raised. Patricia, Derek's sharply dressed, cold-hearted mother, was standing tightly beside her, physically holding Emily's limp shoulders upright with a vicious, unyielding grip. Derek stood on the other side, leaning over the massive mahogany desk, with a sickening, victorious smirk plastered across his arrogant face. Sitting behind the expensive desk was Dr. Aris, a nervous, sweating man wearing a tailored suit under a pristine white medical coat. He was holding a thick stack of legal documents, the very papers that would fraudulently declare my daughter totally mentally incompetent and strip away every single one of her basic human rights. I watched through the glass as the corrupt doctor carefully slid the heavy stack of commitment papers across the smooth wood surface, uncapping an expensive silver fountain pen and placing it directly next to Emily's trembling, unresponsive hand. Derek leaned down forcefully, wrapping his fingers around Emily's limp wrist, physically manipulating her arm to force the signature that would seal her horrifying fate. The heavy digital clock on the clinic wall silently clicked to exactly 3 o'clock. I gave the final decisive tactical signal. The primary operator raised his heavy steel breaching ram and stepped forward. With a single explosive swing of massive kinetic force, he drove the heavy steel ram directly into the center of the heavy oak double doors leading into the suite. The reinforced wood violently splintered and shattered. The heavy metal hinges completely failed, screaming loudly as they were ripped straight out of the doorframe. The massive oak doors crashed onto the polished floor with a deafening, thunderous boom that shook the entire building. I walked deliberately through the settling cloud of wood dust and debris, stepping over the shattered remains of the door. I was no longer the quiet, unassuming suburban grandfather wearing a soft knitted cardigan. I was the executioner, dressed in a sharp, tailored black suit, my face a mask of cold, unrelenting federal fury. The 6 heavily armed tactical operators flooded into the room directly behind me, fanning out with terrifying synchronized speed. They raised their suppressed rifles, the red laser sights locking instantly onto Derek, Patricia, and the corrupt doctor. The sheer overwhelming presence of the tactical strike force instantly sucked all the oxygen out of the luxurious room. Derek stumbled backward, dropping Emily's limp hand. He shielded his face from the settling dust, his arrogant smirk momentarily faltering before rapidly returning. He looked at the heavily armed men, and then he looked directly at me. He let out a loud, mocking laugh, a hollow sound of pure, unadulterated delusion. He genuinely believed his wealth and status made him entirely untouchable. "What the hell is this, old man?" Derek sneered, his voice dripping with absolute condescending contempt as he boldly stepped forward. "Did you actually go out and hire actors for this pathetic little stunt? Are you completely out of your mind? Throw this senile fool out of the building before I have him permanently arrested for trespassing and property damage." Derek turned his head, expecting the doctor to immediately call the private building security. He expected the world to instantly bow to his commands, just as it always had. But Dr. Aris was not laughing. He was not reaching for the telephone. The corrupt psychiatrist was staring directly at the gold federal badges boldly displayed on the tactical vests of the operators standing firmly beside me. He recognized the heavy, undeniable authority of the United States government. The color completely and instantly drained from his sweaty face, leaving him as pale as a corpse. His hands began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. The heavy silver fountain pen slipped from his slick, sweating fingers, dropping onto the mahogany desk with a sharp, echoing clatter that seemed incredibly loud in the suddenly silent room. Dr. Aris slowly raised his trembling hands into the air, completely surrendering before a single verbal command was even issued. He knew exactly what was happening. He knew his lucrative, fraudulent career was instantly and permanently over. Derek noticed the doctor's terrified surrender, and the mocking laughter finally died in his throat. The arrogant smirk slowly melted off his face, replaced by a sudden creeping realization of absolute dread. He looked back at me, his eyes widening, as he finally noticed the cold, heavy federal sidearm holstered securely against my ribs beneath my tailored suit. He finally realized that the harmless old man he had relentlessly mocked, the grandfather he had so casually dismissed, was the very architect of his total, imminent destruction. I stood perfectly still, watching his fabricated reality completely shatter into pieces. Derek stood frozen, his mocking laughter evaporating into the sterile, heavily air-conditioned atmosphere of the clinic waiting room. He looked frantically at the 6 heavily armed tactical operators, his eyes darting from the matte black barrels of their suppressed rifles to the gold federal shields strapped securely to their chests. In his world, money and status dictated the hierarchy of any room. He automatically assumed these men, whoever they were, would ultimately defer to the wealthiest person present. He opened his mouth to issue another arrogant command, to demand they lower their weapons and address him with the respect he believed he deserved. But the words died instantly in his throat. The tactical operators did not even look at him. They did not acknowledge his tailored suit or his indignant posture. Instead, all 6 highly trained federal agents simultaneously shifted their gaze directly toward me, silently awaiting my explicit operational orders. The visual impact of that absolute, unhesitating deference struck Derek like a physical blow. The reality of the situation finally pierced through his impenetrable layers of narcissism. The harmless, quiet father-in-law he had so effortlessly dismissed was completely commanding a federal strike force with nothing more than a subtle shift in his posture. I stepped slowly over the splintered remains of the heavy oak doors, the sound of my leather shoes echoing sharply against the polished hardwood floor. I moved with a deliberate, predatory calmness, closing the physical distance between us until I was standing directly in front of him. Derek instinctively took a half-step backward, his back pressing awkwardly against the edge of the heavy mahogany desk. His breathing became shallow and erratic. I reached inside the interior pocket of my tailored black jacket, my hand deliberately brushing past the cold steel of my holstered sidearm. Derek flinched, his eyes tracking the movement with primal, unadulterated fear. But I did not draw my weapon. Instead, I pulled out a thick, heavy manila dossier. It was the absolute culmination of 72 hours of relentless, highly classified federal investigation. I held the heavy file in my hand for a brief, agonizing moment, letting the unbearable tension stretch across the quiet room. Then, with a sudden violent flick of my wrist, I slammed the dossier down onto the low glass coffee table positioned in the center of the seating area. The explosive force of the impact snapped the metal binding of the folder. A mountain of highly classified, damning evidence violently scattered across the pristine glass surface and fluttered down onto the expensive rug. High-resolution photographs of their secret canvas duffel bag slid across the table, clearly displaying the stacks of European currency and the untraceable burner phones. Crisp official copies of their fraudulent offshore banking ledgers fell next to detailed color-coded flowcharts mapping out the exact structure of their $50 million Ponzi scheme. The digital tracking logs from their decentralized cryptocurrency wallets lay fully exposed, perfectly matching the exact timestamps of the $9,900 withdrawals stolen directly from Emily's emergency trust fund. And right in the center of the scattered pile rested the undeniable ultimate proof of their impending flight. Vivid full-color printouts of the two first-class, one-way boarding passes to Geneva, Switzerland, booked directly under their forged secondary passports. Derek stared down at the glass table, his entire physical universe collapsing in real time. The meticulously constructed illusion of the Preston real estate empire was completely obliterated, laid bare in undeniable black and white federal ink. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled desperately out of the water. He tried to articulate a defense, to spin a plausible lie, but his highly manipulative brain simply could not process the absolute catastrophic totality of his defeat. I stepped directly into his personal space, deliberately invading the protective physical bubble he had maintained his entire adult life. I leaned in incredibly close, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. He could feel the cold, suppressed fury radiating from my entire body. "You thought you were so incredibly clever," I whispered, my voice completely devoid of any human warmth or forgiveness. "You thought you were manipulating a pathetic retired insurance adjuster. You thought you could terrorize my daughter, drain her emergency lifeline, and systematically abuse a 10-year-old child without facing any real consequences. You arrogantly assumed you could simply run away and leave my family to take the devastating fall for your pathetic financial crimes." I paused, letting the devastating weight of my words completely sink into his panicking mind. "You made a fatal miscalculation, Derek. You did not just abuse a defenseless woman. You just assaulted the grandson of the man who literally wrote the federal racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations act that you are currently violating." Derek's arrogant facade completely shattered. The realization of my true identity, the terrifying understanding of the massive, inescapable federal apparatus I commanded, hit him with the devastating force of a wrecking ball. His knees physically buckled under the immense, crushing weight of the revelation. He collapsed heavily against the edge of the wooden desk, gasping desperately for air. Pure, unadulterated terror violently contorted his face. He was completely and utterly ruined, facing decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary, with absolutely no possibility of escape or negotiation. While Derek suffered a total psychological collapse, Patricia suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state of shock. The cold, calculating woman immediately realized that the entire operation was fundamentally compromised. She completely released her vicious grip on Emily's limp, drugged shoulders, letting my fragile daughter slide awkwardly against the armrest of the leather chair. Patricia did not check on her son. She did not attempt to defend their fabricated empire. Driven by sheer pathetic self-preservation, she abruptly spun around and made a desperate, frantic dash toward the secondary exit leading into the private examination rooms at the back of the clinic. It was a completely futile, highly embarrassing attempt to escape the inevitable. Before she could even take 3 steps toward the hallway, 2 of the massive tactical operators moved with blinding fluid speed. They intercepted her path instantly, grabbing her aggressively by the shoulders and spinning her around with undeniable, overwhelming physical force. They forced her wrists violently behind her back, snapping heavy steel handcuffs into place with a sharp, resounding click that echoed through the shattered room. Her desperate escape had lasted exactly 4 seconds. I stepped past Derek and approached the mahogany desk where Dr. Aris was violently trembling. An operative immediately flanked the corrupt psychiatrist, pulling his arms behind his back and locking cold steel cuffs around his sweating wrists. The operative shoved him aggressively against the wall, neutralizing the medical threat instantly. I ignored his pathetic whimpering and gently knelt down beside the leather chair holding my heavily sedated daughter. I placed my hand incredibly softly against her pale cheek. Her glazed eyes slowly flickered toward my face, struggling immensely to focus through the thick chemical fog. "Do not worry, my beautiful, sweet girl," I whispered soothingly, carefully, stroking her hair. "You are completely safe now. The long nightmare is over." The heavy silence of the room was shattered by the sharp, authoritative commands of the tactical operators. I stood up from my daughter's side, my eyes locking entirely onto Derek. The momentary shock that had completely paralyzed him finally broke, replaced immediately by a frantic, pathetic desperation. He lunged wildly toward the mahogany desk, perhaps reaching blindly for the scattered evidence, or perhaps just trying to find a miraculous way to escape his inevitable fate. He never even made it half a step. The lead federal agent moved with terrifying fluid speed, stepping firmly into Derek's path and driving a heavy tactical boot directly into the back of his knee. Derek's leg buckled instantly with a sickening, audible crack. He let out a sharp cry of agony as the massive agent grabbed him roughly by the collar of his expensive tailored suit, lifted him slightly off the floor, and slammed him violently face first into the thick glass of the coffee table. The brutal impact loudly rattled the scattered, incriminating documents. Before Derek could even process the violent takedown, 2 additional operators swarmed him. They pinned his arms painfully behind his back, driving their heavy knees deeply into his spine to completely immobilize his thrashing body. The sharp, metallic click of federal handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed with a profound, terrifying finality. He was violently hauled up from the floor and forced onto his knees, a pathetic, whimpering shell of the arrogant tyrant who had ruthlessly terrorized my family. Across the room, Patricia suddenly began to scream. The cold, calculating matriarch of the Preston Empire completely lost her polished, wealthy facade. As the operators forcefully hauled her toward the shattered doorway, she thrashed violently, kicking her expensive designer shoes aggressively against the wooden doorframe. She shrieked wildly about her prominent social status, threatening loudly to sue the entire federal government and demanding desperately to speak to the local police chief, whom they had been actively bribing for over a decade. The tactical agents completely ignored her hysterical, pathetic threats. They dragged her roughly through the splintered entrance and out into the waiting armored vehicles, her frantic screams slowly fading into the quiet afternoon air until they were completely silenced by the heavy slamming of thick steel doors. I turned my absolute attention back to Derek. He was kneeling awkwardly on the polished floor, breathing heavily, his nose bleeding slightly from the forceful impact against the thick glass. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. My secure phone vibrated heavily in my pocket. I reached inside my dark suit jacket and pulled out a sleek, encrypted tactical tablet. I swiped the dark screen, opening a direct, high-definition video feed securely transmitted from the local international airport. I walked slowly over to Derek and held the glowing screen directly in front of his sweating, bleeding face. "Take a very close look, Derek," I instructed, my voice a low, rumbling echo of absolute doom. "Your father thought he was incredibly smart. He thought he could conveniently abandon you here to handle the messy medical paperwork while he quietly boarded the private charter flight to Geneva 3 days ahead of schedule." Derek stared blankly at the tablet, his breath catching painfully in his throat. The live video feed displayed the sprawling sunlit tarmac of the private aviation terminal. Victor Preston was standing anxiously near the boarding stairs of a sleek white jet, clutching a heavy leather briefcase. He looked frantic, yelling angrily at the pilot to immediately start the engines. But before he could take a single step onto the aircraft, 4 unmarked black tactical vans completely surrounded the plane, screeching to a halt with blinding, terrifying speed. Over a dozen heavily armed agents from the Department of Homeland Security poured rapidly out of the vehicles. The secure feed captured the exact moment Victor realized his grand escape was completely thwarted. He dropped his heavy briefcase in absolute shock, the latches popping open to spill thick stacks of forged travel documents across the gray concrete. 2 massive federal agents tackled the older man directly to the ground, pinning him fiercely against the rough tarmac and securing his wrists tightly behind his back. "He is not going to Switzerland," I stated coldly, watching the total despair wash completely over Derek's pale face. "He is going directly to a federal holding cell right alongside you and your corrupt mother." But the absolute destruction of their criminal empire was not quite complete. I tapped a separate secure application on the encrypted tablet, opening the direct digital interface to the decentralized cryptocurrency exchange. The screen illuminated brightly with the exact balance of the massive offshore holding wallet Derek had meticulously constructed. $12,400,000 sat completely stagnant in the digital escrow, waiting for the final authorization key that Derek had planned to execute the exact moment my daughter was securely locked inside a psychiatric ward. "You built a very sophisticated digital fortress, Derek," I murmured, my finger hovering just a fraction of an inch above the glowing screen. "But you fundamentally failed to understand that the federal government possesses extraction algorithms that make your pathetic encryption protocols look like absolute child's play. We cloned your entire network. We perfectly mapped your digital signatures. And we have the absolute legal authority to seize every single penny of your fraudulent stolen wealth right now." I pressed the execution button on the tablet. The screen flashed a brilliant, blinding red. Derek watched in total silent horror as the massive digital balance immediately plummeted from over $12 million down to absolute zero in a matter of mere milliseconds. The funds were instantly drained, permanently seized and secured by the Federal Treasury Department. The untraceable offshore accounts were completely wiped out. The stolen trust funds, the fraudulent real estate capital, the entire financial foundation of the Preston legacy was completely, irreversibly erased from existence. "You have absolutely nothing left," I whispered, stepping back and letting the tablet drop to my side. "No money, no power, no corrupt police chief to protect you, and absolutely nowhere to hide." Derek finally broke. The arrogant, sadistic predator completely vanished, replaced entirely by a sobbing, broken coward. He slumped forward against the heavy physical restraints, thick tears streaming down his bruised face, mixing sickeningly with the fresh blood on his chin. He looked up at me, his chest heaving with pathetic, racking sobs. He completely abandoned any remaining shred of his personal pride. "Please," he begged, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine that echoed miserably in the sterile clinic. "Please, Rick, I am so incredibly sorry. I will do whatever you want. I will testify against my own father. I will give you the names of every corrupt official on our payroll. Just please do not do this to me. We are family. Please, Dad, I am begging you." The word hung in the quiet air, a disgusting, vile insult to everything I firmly stood for. He had the absolute audacity to call me his father after spending years systematically torturing my daughter and physically abusing my grandson. I slowly crouched down until my eyes were perfectly level with his terrified, weeping face. I looked directly into the deep, hollow void of his absolute failure. "You are not my family," I whispered, my voice as cold and heavy as a tombstone. "You are just a pathetic, greedy parasite that I have finally permanently exterminated." I stood up smoothly, turning my back entirely on the weeping, ruined man kneeling on the floor. The tactical operators hauled Derek roughly to his feet, dragging him violently toward the splintered doorway to join his mother in the waiting federal transport vehicles. I did not watch them leave. The tactical execution was officially complete. The entire Preston family was completely eradicated from our lives forever. I walked back to the plush leather chair where my daughter was resting peacefully. The tactical medics had already entered the room, administering a mild chemical counteractant to slowly neutralize the heavy sedatives completely corrupting her system. Emily shifted slightly, her breathing becoming much steadier and significantly deeper. The terrifying vacant glaze was slowly beginning to fade from her beautiful eyes. I slid my arms carefully beneath her frail shoulders and her resting knees. I lifted her effortlessly against my chest, holding her securely against my tailored black suit. She rested her heavy head against my shoulder, letting out a soft, tired sigh of absolute relief. I carried my daughter straight out of that shattered, corrupt clinic, walking proudly past the broken doors and out into the bright, warm afternoon sun, leaving the absolute ruin of their empire entirely behind us. Exactly 30 days had passed since I carried my daughter out of that sterile, corrupt medical clinic and stepped safely into the warm afternoon sun. The healing process for Emily and Lucas was incredibly slow, but it was remarkably steady. I had moved them permanently into my home on that very first night, transforming the 2 empty guest rooms into a warm sanctuary of absolute safety and quiet comfort. The heavy chemical fog that the corrupt doctor had maliciously pumped into Emily's delicate system had completely dissipated within the first 72 hours following her dramatic rescue. The deep psychological scars required significantly more time, dedicated professional therapy, and boundless patience. We spent our quiet evenings sitting together on my old wooden back porch, drinking hot tea, and simply watching the autumn leaves slowly turn brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Lucas had successfully returned to a highly rated private school in my neighborhood. His natural, vibrant curiosity and incredibly bright energy were returning to his face now that the suffocating shadow of Derek and Victor Preston had been completely removed from his young life. The constant fear that had plagued my grandson was finally gone. The immediate fallout of the highly coordinated federal raid was absolutely unprecedented in the history of the city. The total catastrophic collapse of the Preston real estate empire dominated the local and national news cycles for several consecutive weeks. Every single morning, a new damning headline splashed boldly across the television screens and the front pages of the financial newspapers, detailing the staggering magnitude of their $50 million Ponzi scheme. The incredibly arrogant men who had routinely paraded their stolen wealth across the elite social pages were now unanimously regarded as the premier villains of the entire state. Tommy had executed the subsequent federal prosecution with flawless, absolutely ruthless efficiency. The grand jury indictment was completely airtight, heavily fortified by the mirrored digital clones, the seized cryptocurrency ledgers, and the unassailable audio recordings I had meticulously gathered during my secret infiltration. Both Victor and Derek Preston were officially classified by the federal magistrate as extreme flight risks. The presiding federal judge, possessing a massive mountain of hard evidence regarding their intercepted private jet and forged international passports, immediately denied them any opportunity for bail. They were currently sitting inside the cold concrete walls of the maximum security wing at the Federal Detention Center. They were actively staring down the barrel of 30 long years in federal lockup, without the slightest possibility of parole or early release. Patricia Preston suffered a uniquely poetic and highly satisfying downfall. The incredibly proud, icy matriarch who had built her entire social identity on ruthless superiority and endless material wealth was instantly stripped of absolutely everything she held dear. Because she was officially listed as a named operational officer on multiple fraudulent shell companies within their corrupt network, her personal assets were completely frozen and permanently seized by the federal government under the expansive federal asset forfeiture statutes. She was forcefully evicted from the sprawling manicured estate where I had once fixed a leaking sink. That massive mansion was currently sitting empty, waiting to be auctioned off to properly compensate the hundreds of innocent victims they had systematically defrauded over the past decade. The elite social circles she had aggressively dominated and heavily relied upon immediately turned their collective backs on her, treating her like an absolute highly contagious pariah. No one would answer her desperate telephone calls. No one would offer her a loan. My private tactical operatives provided me with a final update regarding her current miserable situation. Patricia, completely penniless and utterly desperate to pay her mounting astronomical legal fees, was currently working a minimum wage job. She was employed as a late-shift cashier at a dismal fluorescent-lit convenience store located on the dirty industrial outskirts of the city, forced to humble herself before the exact type of working-class people she had always deeply despised. The final definitive chapter of their absolute ruin concluded on a rainy Tuesday morning at the massive federal courthouse downtown. I put on my tailored charcoal black suit, the exact same physical armor I had worn on the day of the violent tactical extraction, and drove my unmarked sedan to the imposing stone building. It was the official asset forfeiture hearing, a mandatory legal procedure required. Officially transfer the stolen trust funds safely back to Emily, and to permanently dissolve the Preston corporate entities forever. I walked silently into the crowded, echoing courtroom and took a discreet seat in the very back row, blending perfectly into the heavy, quiet shadows near the exit. I wanted to remain entirely unobserved. I watched with quiet, absolute stillness as the heavy wooden side door slowly opened and the armed federal marshals forcefully escorted the shackled prisoners into the brightly lit room. Derek walked slowly and painfully toward the heavy wooden defense table. The physical and mental transformation was truly staggering to witness. The incredibly arrogant, sharply dressed tycoon who had sneered at me in the clinic was completely gone. He was wearing an ill-fitting, terribly bright orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His wrists and ankles were heavily shackled with thick, heavy steel chains that rattled loudly and embarrassingly with every single agonizing step he took. He looked physically broken, entirely defeated, and remarkably aged. His previously rigid posture was completely hunched, his skin terribly pale and deeply lined with the profound, inescapable terror of a man who finally understood that his privileged life was completely, permanently over. Victor shuffled closely behind his son, looking exactly like a hollow, entirely defeated ghost. The older man was entirely stripped of the unchecked power and massive influence he had violently wielded for several consecutive decades. Derek slowly turned his head and scanned the crowded courtroom. His bloodshot eyes swept anxiously over the wooden benches until they locked directly onto mine. For a long, silent moment, the entire world seemed to completely pause. I saw the desperate, pathetic pleading echoing loudly in his terrified gaze. I saw a broken man begging for a tiny sliver of mercy, hoping that some fragment of the forgiving grandfather he used to know still existed inside my heart. He mouthed the word "Dad" across the silent room. I simply stared back at him with absolute, unyielding coldness. I did not offer a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the slightest trace of sorrow, remorse, or regret. I only felt the cold, deeply satisfying, and profound peace of a highly complicated, extremely dangerous job, flawlessly and cleanly finished. I offered him a slow, almost imperceptible nod of absolute crushing finality. The corrupt, untouchable empire they had built on the broken backs of innocent people was officially reduced to nothing more than a pathetic pile of digital ashes. I stood up smoothly from the hard wooden bench, turned my back completely on the ruined men, and walked proudly out of the quiet courtroom. The cool air outside smelled exactly like fresh rain and beautiful new beginnings. I smiled softly, stepped into the bright city street, and drove home to my family. Exactly 1 full month had passed since the violent tactical extraction successfully shattered the terrifying nightmare that had completely consumed my family. The deafening sirens, the frantic courtroom battles, and the chaotic media frenzy surrounding the spectacular downfall of the Preston real estate empire felt like a distant, fading memory. We were currently located 300 miles away from that toxic environment safely isolated at my private, secluded lake cabin nestled deep within the towering evergreen forests of upstate New York. The crisp, cool autumn air blowing across the crystal-clear water carried the incredibly refreshing scent of ancient pine needles and damp earth. It was a place of profound, absolute tranquility, entirely, completely disconnected from the fraudulent, poisonous world Derek and Victor had meticulously constructed. I sat comfortably on the worn wooden planks of the expansive back porch, wrapped warmly in a thick wool sweater, breathing in the deeply restorative silence. The heavy dark shadows that had relentlessly haunted my daughter and my young grandson were finally beginning to recede. Healing a deeply fractured soul requires an immense amount of time, but for the first time in several agonizing years, we were finally breathing freely and completely peacefully again. Emily was standing near the large bay window inside the cozy cabin, bathed warmly in the bright morning sunlight. The heavy, aggressive psychiatric medications that Dr. Aris had maliciously forced into her delicate system were entirely gone. She was completely detoxified. The terrifying vacant glaze that had haunted her beautiful eyes had been permanently replaced by a sharp, returning clarity and a fiercely resilient spark. She was no longer the fragile, broken ghost who had blindly submitted to Derek's manipulative psychological torture. Over the past 4 weeks, I had slowly begun revealing the true, staggering magnitude of my actual financial empire to her. I showed her the complex portfolios, the secured offshore accounts, and the massive corporate holdings I had quietly managed during my supposed retirement. She was actively learning the intricate ropes of our true generational wealth, completely determined to never allow another greedy parasite to exploit her trusting nature again. Watching her confidently analyze the legal documents and firmly reclaim her stolen independence filled my chest with an overwhelming sense of profound, undeniable pride. The devastating trauma had not destroyed her spirit. It had aggressively forged her into an incredibly strong, thoroughly unbreakable woman ready for absolutely anything. Down by the calm edge of the sparkling water, Lucas was happily fishing off the end of the long wooden dock. The constant suffocating fear that used to dictate his every movement had completely vanished from his bright, expressive face. He was no longer nervously watching the doorway, expecting to be aggressively yelled at or physically punished for simply acting like a normal child. He cast his fishing line far out into the deep blue water, letting out a loud, joyous laugh as a small fish tugged playfully against the brightly colored bobber. The terrifying red welts that Derek had viciously left on his neck were completely healed, leaving perfectly smooth, unblemished skin. I watched my grandson reel in the empty hook with a wide, carefree smile, totally absorbed in the pure, innocent magic of a quiet autumn morning. Seeing him thrive in this secure environment firmly validated every single ruthless action I had taken. I had violently burned a corrupt empire straight to the ground, specifically to ensure that the joyful, ringing sound of his laughter would never be silenced by the cruel hands of a narcissistic abuser ever again. His beautiful freedom was completely secured for all eternity. I took a slow, highly satisfying sip of my steaming black coffee, letting the rich, bitter flavor wash over my palate. The local news media back in the city was still absolutely dominated by the catastrophic fall of the Preston family. Victor and Derek had been comprehensively denied bail by the presiding federal magistrate, permanently stripped of their luxurious tailored suits, and forced into bleak, terribly uncomfortable prison uniforms. They were currently facing over 30 years in a maximum security federal lockup for masterminding the massive racketeering scheme. Their vast network of fraudulent shell companies, fake clinics, and illicit offshore accounts had been completely seized, aggressively liquidated, and systematically redistributed to compensate their countless innocent victims. Patricia Preston, the once proud and deeply vicious socialite, was now officially penniless. She was currently working a grueling minimum-wage retail job on the grimy industrial outskirts of the city just to barely afford her mounting astronomical legal defense fees. The supposedly untouchable, highly elite real estate dynasty had been thoroughly reduced to a pathetic, embarrassing pile of smoldering ashes. They had absolutely nothing left to their names except the harsh, miserable reality of their own devastating, completely inescapable and permanent federal ruin. Last week, I had quietly attended the final asset forfeiture hearing at the massive downtown federal courthouse. I sat completely unobserved in the very back row, watching with total detachment as the armed marshals escorted Derek into the brightly lit room. He looked physically shattered, heavily shackled in thick steel chains that rattled loudly against the polished floor. The intense, arrogant predator who had ruthlessly plotted to lock my daughter in a psychiatric ward was completely gone. He was nothing more than a terrified, rapidly aging prisoner, desperately facing a bleak, entirely hopeless future. As his bloodshot eyes anxiously scanned the crowded courtroom and finally locked onto mine, I felt absolutely no pity. I did not feel the slightest trace of sorrow or regret for completely obliterating his life. I felt only the cold, deeply profound satisfaction of a highly complicated, extremely dangerous tactical job, flawlessly executed and cleanly finished. I offered him a single, barely perceptible nod of absolute finality before turning my back on him forever. He was no longer a threat. He was just a vile, disgusting parasite that I had successfully exterminated to permanently protect the absolute sanctity of my own bloodline from his toxic evil. Emily walked out onto the wooden porch, holding a steaming mug of her own. She stood silently beside my chair, gazing out across the incredibly serene, undisturbed surface of the large lake. The heavy, oppressive weight of the psychological torture she had endured for years was completely lifted from her shoulders. She looked down at me and offered a soft, deeply genuine smile that instantly warmed my heart. We had established a completely new, incredibly resilient foundation for our entire family, aggressively built on absolute truth, total transparency, and unwavering mutual protection. The stolen trust funds had been entirely recovered, completely legally restored, and heavily fortified against any future malicious intrusions. Derek's incredibly greedy, desperate attempt to steal her inherited wealth had ultimately resulted in his complete permanent removal from her life. She was finally free to build her own incredibly bright future without his suffocating, manipulative control entirely overshadowing her every single choice. I reached out and gently squeezed her hand silently, promising that I would permanently remain vigilant against any external threat that ever dared to approach our peaceful sanctuary. We stood there together, two profoundly unbroken survivors, quietly watching young Lucas joyfully reeling in another small fish. Sitting comfortably on the quiet wooden porch, I finally understood the profound truth about my chosen retirement. I had genuinely believed that burying my dangerous past and hiding my substantial power behind the harmless facade of a quiet suburban grandfather was the best way to live a peaceful life. I had deliberately chosen to play the fool, projecting weakness and gentle passivity to avoid conflict. But I now realized that keeping my true capabilities completely hidden was a monumental mistake that had inadvertently invited dangerous predators straight into our lives. The Prestons had interpreted my deliberate silence as pathetic ignorance and my gentle kindness as exploitable weakness. Unleashing the terrifying, calculated monster inside me was the absolute only way to permanently save my family from complete destruction. I would never hide my true strength again. I am the steadfast protector, the unyielding shield, and the true, undeniable patriarch of this family. I took another long, quiet sip of my hot coffee, listening to the gentle rustle of the autumn leaves blowing through the towering trees. I closed my eyes, taking in a deep, cleansing breath, and finally felt an overwhelming sense of absolute beautiful and completely unshakable peace forever today. Never mistake a person for being ignorant just because they choose silence. Do not mistake their kindness for weakness. True strength does not need to shout, flex, or boast. It quietly observes, patiently gathers evidence, and waits for the perfect moment to strike. Predators like the Prestons thrive on the assumption that good people are completely defenseless. But the absolute most dangerous person in the room is often the one sitting quietly in the corner, playing the fool while holding all the cards. Protect your family fiercely, trust your gut instincts, and always remember that actions carry severe permanent consequences. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please smash that like button right now. Have you ever had to deal with toxic relatives who thought they were entirely untouchable? Drop your personal story in the comments below. Do not forget to subscribe for more crazy stories.